The Kennedys. 2 political assassinations within 5 years, a family name that still functions as a political symbol today, and a public that has turned real people into a national narrative. The Kennedys are America's most famous political dynasty, admired by some, projected onto by others. But if we put the myth aside for a moment, what remains? Not a curse, a system, ambition, strategic positioning, loyalty, and a media logic that makes every deviation instantly public. How does a family become a brand that shapes a country? Who decides who stands in the spotlight and who remains in the background? If you enjoy deep dives into power and political dynasties, this channel is for you. To understand the Kennedys, we don't begin with Dallas. We begin with a father who turned ambition into a plan for an entire generation. Stay with us, because the deeper we look, the more complex this dynasty becomes. Every clan begins with a decision, not only to accumulate power, but to pass it on. In the case of the Kennedys, that figure is Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. He is not the most famous member of the family, but he is its architect. Kennedy built wealth and influence during a period when financial markets, media, and political access were rapidly expanding in the United States. He worked as a financier and investor and became involved in the early film industry, a sector where money and public influence already intersected. Later, he moved closer to political power. In the 1930s, he served as chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission, and from 1938 to 1940 as U.S. ambassador to the United Kingdom. At this point, the project changes character. It is no longer only about wealth. It is about creating an environment in which power can be reproduced. Stories have long circulated that Kennedy profited from bootlegging during Prohibition. Historians, however, have never found reliable proof, a reminder that myth often grows faster than verifiable structure. The family also established a physical center early on. The Kennedy compound in Hyannisport, purchased in the late 1920s, would become a focal point for decades. This is the moment when success turns into a dynasty. Joseph Kennedy no longer only supports the next generation, he begins to plan it. Power in dynasties is rarely accidental, it is prepared. In the Kennedy family, preparation began with a father who did not simply want success for himself. He wanted to build influence that could last beyond his own career. Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. invested heavily in the future of his sons. Politics was not treated as a distant possibility, but as a strategic path. Originally, the eldest son, Joseph Kennedy Jr., was expected to become the political leader of the family. His death in World War II in 1944 changed that plan. In many families, such a loss would have ended the project. For the Kennedys, it meant reassignment. The expectations shifted to John. John F. Kennedy became the public face of the family's ambitions. His brother Robert Kennedy emerged as the strategist and closest political confidant. When John became President of the United States in 1961, Robert served as Attorney General, placing 2 brothers at the center of national power. This was not coincidence. It reflected the structure their father had imagined: a visible leader, a trusted inner circle, and a family name that functioned as political capital. After the assassinations of the 1960s, the architecture shifted again. Ted Kennedy remained in the U.S. Senate for decades, providing continuity long after the dramatic moments had passed. Because in political dynasties, power is rarely secured by headlines alone. It is secured by permanence. In powerful families, belonging is rarely only emotional. It is structured through access, visibility, and control over how the family is perceived. For the Kennedys, that dynamic became fully visible during the presidency of John F. Kennedy. Television was transforming American politics. The White House became a stage, and the Kennedy name increasingly functioned as political capital. At the center of this image stood someone who held no elected office, but shaped public perception enormously: Jacqueline Kennedy. As First Lady, she oversaw the restoration of the White House and presented it as part of the nation's cultural heritage. After the assassination in 1963, she reinforced the image of her husband's presidency through the famous Camelot narrative, introduced in a conversation with journalist Theodore H. White. In this way, memory itself became a political instrument. Inside the family, control was rarely exercised through formal rules. Instead, it emerged through proximity and roles. Robert Kennedy's position as Attorney General illustrated how family loyalty and institutional power could overlap. But systems built on visibility carry a cost. When a surname becomes a national symbol, the boundary between public image and private life becomes increasingly fragile. And this is where the Kennedy story becomes far more complicated than the myth suggests. In political clans, loyalty is rarely optional. It functions as a form of currency. During John F. Kennedy's presidency, Robert F. Kennedy served not only as Attorney General, but also as one of his closest advisors. He was part of the small group of decision-makers during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, demonstrating how family proximity could translate directly into political influence. Within the Kennedy network, influence was rarely accidental. It was structured through trust and shared history. After the assassinations of 1963 and 1968, the internal balance of power shifted again. Ted Kennedy became the most prominent political figure of the remaining generation. In 1969, however, an event changed the trajectory of his career. The Chappaquiddick incident involved a car accident in which Mary Jo Kopechner lost her life. Ted Kennedy reported the accident only the following morning and later pleaded guilty to leaving the scene. He received a suspended sentence. The episode severely damaged his presidential ambitions. In dynastic systems, misconduct rarely remains private. It reshapes the limits of what remains politically possible. Ted Kennedy would continue to serve in the U.S. Senate for decades, but the presidency remained out of reach. Some images become part of a nation's memory. One of them shows a small boy standing beside his mother, raising his hand in salute as his father's coffin passes on November 25, 1963. The boy was John F. Kennedy Jr. At 3 years old, he had already become a symbol. Growing up, Kennedy lived under constant public attention. Every stage of his life, school, university, and later law school, was followed by the media. Even ordinary events became public stories. When he passed the New York bar exam on his third attempt, the result was widely reported. In political dynasties, even routine setbacks can become national headlines. As an adult, Kennedy explored ways to define his own path. In 1995, he founded George magazine, an attempt to present politics in a more accessible and culturally relevant format. Rather than immediately entering electoral politics, he experimented with influence through media. Public speculation about a future political career never disappeared, but one fact remained clear. John F. Kennedy Jr. never ran for office. His personal life was also followed closely. His marriage to Carolyn Bessette in 1996 attracted intense media attention and often blurred the boundary between private life and public fascination. Then, in July 1999, tragedy struck. The small aircraft Kennedy was piloting crashed near Martha's Vineyard. He, his wife, and her sister were killed. Investigators later concluded that the likely cause was pilot disorientation during night flight conditions. With his death, more than a life ended. For many observers, it also closed the final chapter of a generation that had carried the expectations of the Kennedy name. And it left a question that still lingers. How much freedom does a person truly have when their surname already carries a legacy? Public conflicts rarely begin with a single event. They emerge when internal tensions meet a public eager for stories. In the case of the Kennedys, almost every fracture within the family became visible. 2 assassinations, a political scandal, and decades of intense media attention ensured that the dynasty was rarely able to control its own narrative. The Kennedys were among the first political families to exist fully in the television age. Visibility became permanent, and with it, vulnerability. Media logic simplifies complex realities. It turns institutions into individuals and transforms structural conflicts into personal stories. For the family, This meant a gradual loss of control over interpretation. Yet, time changes perception. What once appeared as scandal slowly becomes history, and history, over time, often turns into myth. The story of the Kennedys is neither a simple tragedy nor a straightforward success story. It is a case study of how power operates when it becomes hereditary. A father who plans influence for the next generation, sons who reach the highest political offices, a first lady who shapes national memory, and a son who grows up surrounded by expectations without ever seeking office himself. What remains is not a curse, but a pattern. Power in dynasties rarely comes from elections alone. It grows through networks, loyalty, and control over narratives. But every generation must eventually decide how much of that legacy it is willing to carry. The Kennedys built one of the most influential political families in modern history. Yet, their story also reveals the tension between identity and symbolism, between being a person and becoming a symbol. If you want to understand how other powerful families manage influence, loyalty, and public image, stay tuned for the next analysis.